So we're going to be looking at memory this week. Last week we looked at social influence. Both of these are topics on paper 1 alongside attachment and psychopathology. Paper 1 is worth 96 marks and is 2 hours long. Remember, you need to be revising research methods alongside these topics, as research methods could come up in this paper, even though it doesn't say it on the advanced information. Research methods can come up in paper 1 in any of the topic areas. So please be aware of that. You need to be revising research methods alongside the paper 1 topics. The memory section is worth 24 marks and should take you 30 minutes. Within the advanced information, we've got 3 key bullet points. So we're looking at the multi-store model of memory, the working memory model, and improving the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. The first bullet point we'll look at is the multi-store model of memory. Within this, we need to be aware of the sensory register, short-term memory, long-term memory, and the features of each store, including the coding, capacity, and duration of each of the stores within the multi-store model of memory. So we'll start with that. So the multi-store model of memory was developed by Atkinson and Schifrin. As you can see, we've got 3 key parts to the multi-store model of memory. The first key part is sensory memory, or the sensory register, as it's stated on the specification. The sensory register takes in information from the environment. So this goes to our senses, such as sights and sounds, etc. If we do not pay attention to things that enter our sensory memory or our sensory register, then that information is forgotten. The sensory register has a really short duration, like 0.25 of a second. If we pay attention to the information that goes into the sensory register, then it will move into our short-term memory. Within our short-term memory, this information is maintained through rehearsal. So we have maintenance rehearsal here, and we have elaborate rehearsal where we link a key memory with something that is meaningful. And if we link it with something that is meaningful, it's more likely to enter our long-term memory. If we do not rehearse the information in our short-term memory, then this information is forgotten through decay or displacement. So it will decay in around 18 to 20 seconds, because that is the duration of our short-term memory, or it could be displaced by new information entering our short-term memory. The information from our short-term memory that is rehearsed moves into the long-term memory. The long-term memory has an unlimited capacity, and its duration could be up to a lifetime. Within our long-term memory, however, information can still be forgotten, and it can be forgotten through interference. So you have proactive interference, where older memories interfere with newer memories, and you have retroactive interference when newer memories interfere with older memories. And then the information can also be forgotten through retrieval failure. And retrieval failure links to context-dependent forgetting and state-dependent forgetting. So context-dependent forgetting is the idea that when we learn some new information, we link it to a context, and the context could be the place in which we learn the information. And if we go back to that place, it makes it easier for us to remember the information. And state-dependent forgetting is linked to the state that we're in, so our psychological state when we learn information, or our physiological state. And if we go back to that state, then it can help us remember that information. So you've got your model of memory there. Remember, if you get an extended answer question, or even a short answer question that asks you to describe the multi-store model of memory, you can actually draw the diagram. But if you are drawing the diagram, then you need to include the features of each of the stores. So the diagram that you see in front of you is a really good diagram, but you wouldn't get full marks for that diagram, because you also need to state the coding capacity and duration of each of the stores when you are describing the multi-store model of memory. So if you take that diagram and you combine it with the next part, which we're going to look at, which is the features of each store, then that would be a really good diagram that you can use in a describe part of question when it says describe the multistore model of memory. If you are drawing the diagram to describe the multistore model of memory, I would also write a couple of sentences underneath just to explain what happens. So a couple of sentences saying like, information comes from the environment into the sensory register. If we pay attention to it, it moves into short-term memory. If this information is rehearsed, it moves into long-term memory. If it isn't rehearsed, it will be forgotten through decay or displacement. Information in the long-term memory can be retrieved and moved into short-term memory. It can also be forgotten through interference or retrieval failure. So just a couple of sentences underneath, just to clarify what you're talking about, just to make sure the examiner can see that you understand what happens within the model. And like I said, you need to make sure you include the features of each store, which is what we're going to look at now. So the sensory register has a duration of 0.25 seconds, its capacity is unlimited, and the coding is all sensory input. With regards to the type of coding, you might have some additional information in your notes. So visual information is coded visually. There's two main stores. So we've got iconic memory, which is the visual information, and echoic memory, which is to do with sounds. So you might have that information in your notes, and if you do, you can include that. So within the sensory register, we have the iconic and echoic stores, and then we have other sensory stores. With regards to short-term memory, the duration is 18 to 20 seconds. The capacity is 7 plus or minus 2 items, so that ranges from 5 to 9 items. The coding is acoustic, which is to do with sounds. Long-term memory, the duration is hours to years. Capacity is unlimited, and the coding is mainly semantic. So coding is the format in which information is stored in our memory stores. Capacity is the amount of information that can be held in a memory store, and duration is the length of time information can be held in memory. We'll go through each one because we've got studies to support them. So this research for coding capacity and duration looks at short-term memory and long-term memory and the differences between the stores, and you can actually use this information to support the multi-store model of memory, but I'll explain that a little bit more when we go through the evaluation. So for coding, short-term memory information is coded acoustically, which is to do with sounds. Long-term memory information is coded semantically, which is to do with meaning. So Badley did a study in 1966 and looked at acoustic and semantic coding in short-term memory and long-term memory. Participants were given lists of words to remember. The first group had acoustically similar words, so words that sounded the same. Second group, acoustically dissimilar words, so words that sounded differently. Third group, semantically similar words, words that had the same or similar meaning. And fourth group, semantically dissimilar words, so words that had a different meaning. And you can see in the brackets there's a few examples just to try and explain that a little bit better. Participants were shown the words and asked to recall them in the correct order. They found when they tested them after a short period of time, when they were focusing on short-term memory, people did worse on acoustically similar words. This therefore suggests that information in our short-term memory is stored acoustically because we've got lots and lots of words that sound the same, all stored in our short-term memory, and it's really, really hard for us to recall them in the correct order because they're all stored according to how they sound. So we've got them all jumbled up in one big box, for example. All the words that sound the same are in a big box, and it's really hard for you to pick out which ones came first and which ones came second. Within the long-term memory condition, so when they were tested after a longer interval, participants did worse on semantically similar words, so words that had a similar meaning, which therefore suggests that all of the words that have a similar meaning are stored in the same box in our long-term memory, and therefore it's harder for us to work out which ones came first, second, and recall them in the correct order. So this study supports the idea that short-term memory information is stored acoustically, and in long-term memory, information is stored semantically. We've got some evaluation of this research. So, a strength of the research is that Badley identified clear differences between the two memory stores. So, it was really important in developing the multi-store model of memory, and it's really good support for the multi-store model of memory because it shows that the features of each store are different. A limitation, the stimuli used were artificial, so that's like lists of words, and that doesn't relate that doesn't relate to how we use our memory in everyday life. So, for example, in everyday life, the things we need to remember have a personal meaning, so we might process that information differently. So, it's not often that we're asked to recall a list of words. If you're asked to recall information, it's usually like information for an exam or a shopping list which relates to things that you need or information about things that are going on in your life. So it doesn't really represent how we use our memory in everyday life. So you could say that the study lacks validity, external validity. So that's the coding. So we've got Badley and it's the acoustic and semantic coding. Then we've got capacity. So the capacity of short-term memory is 7 plus minus 2 items. And this research here focuses mainly on short-term memory because it's really hard for us to test the capacity of long-term memory because it is unlimited. So we've got two pieces of research here. We've got Jacobs, who measured digit span. So the researcher would read out a number of digits and the participant would recall these out loud in the correct order. So they might give them 4 digits, ask them to recall them, 5 digits, ask them to recall them, 6 digits, but they would be random digits and they would continue until that individual struggled. They found that the average or mean digit span was 9.7 items. When they did the same experiment, but for letters, they found that the mean span for letters was 7.3. So that fits the 7 plus minus 2 items. And the 7 plus minus 2 items theory was developed by Miller. So Miller put forward the idea that the capacity of short-term memory is around 7 items plus or minus 2. So he suggested that we chunk information as well to make it easier to recall. So if you think about when you've got large numbers like telephone numbers to recall and they're more than 9 items, what you would do is you would chunk those so you would remember like groups of 3 or groups of 4 when you're trying to recall telephone numbers. Again, we have some evaluation for this. So a strength of Jacob's study that has been replicated and his findings have been confirmed in other better controlled studies because it was a really old study. The newer studies which have higher levels of control have found similar findings, so it suggests that it's a valid study of digit span. But a limitation with regards to Miller might have overestimated the short-term memory capacity because further research, such as this study by Cowan, who reviewed lots of research, found that the capacity of short-term memory was 4 plus and minus 1 chunks. So more recent research seems to question what Miller has found, and more recent research suggests that the capacity of short-term memory is smaller than what Miller suggested. So then we have got just go back, sorry. Then we've got duration. So next we're going to look at duration, which is the length of time information can be held in memory. And we've got a piece of research for short-term memory and a piece of research for long-term memory here. So for this study for short-term memory, the duration is 18 to 20 seconds, long-term memory up to a lifetime. So the study for short-term memory was conducted by Peterson and Peterson. They had 24 students and the students went through 8 trials, and on each trial they were given a syllable to remember, a constant syllable. So they were given a triad, so 3 letters to recall. These 3 letters would be random and they wouldn't be in a particular order. So it wouldn't be like ABC. An example there is YGC. So these are letters that are not in an order that we can already remember. So they were given this triad of letters, and they were told to count backwards from a given number. So count backwards from 100, and them counting backwards, prevented them from rehearsing that information. They were stopped at different times to recall the syllable. So, for example, they would be given the 3 letters YGC to remember. Then they would say, count backwards from 100. And as they were counting backwards from 100, they would have a timer, and they would stop them after 3 seconds, and they would say, right, tell me the syllable. And they would do a different group of 3 letters, the same thing again. They'd stop them after 10 seconds and ask them to recall the 3 letters. They found that after 3 seconds, recall was around 80%. After 18 seconds, recall was around 3%. So you can see that it drops significantly, and it suggests that the duration is around 18 seconds, because after 18 seconds, it was much, much lower. Then the study for long-term memory, you've got Barrick et al. Barrick looked at 392 participants. These participants were aged from 17 to 74, and they asked them to recall images of people in their high school year. So they took some of their yearbooks and they asked them to either do a photo recall, so they would look at the images and they would try and recall which individuals were in their class, and they would do a free recall. So in the free recall condition, they were just asked to recall the names of the people in their graduating class. They found that if they did the test within 15 years of that individual graduating, then recall was 90% in photo recognition. But if it was after 48 years of them graduating, it declined to 70%. Both of those numbers are still pretty high. In the free recall condition, it was 60% after 15 years, and it declined to 30% after 48 years. So people that graduated 48 years ago could still remember around 30% of individuals that were in their graduating class. So there's pretty good numbers, and that's why they suggest it lasts up to a lifetime. In evaluation, Barrick's research has high external validity because it investigates meaningful memory. So it represents how we use our memory in everyday life to remember people that we've seen and people that we have relationships with. But a limitation of the short-term memory research, Peterson and Peterson, is that it uses artificial stimuli. It does represent some forms of everyday memory, so like remembering phone numbers, where we group things together and we remember them in small groups of numbers, but it doesn't represent the majority of everyday memory activities. So we're often trying to recall meaningful information, so it lacks external validity. And that's a common pattern with the lab research for memory. It tends to lack external validity, but although it lacks external validity, one good thing that the research has is that it's got a high level of control. So because it has a high level of control, it's easier for us to establish a causal relationship. So we've got the features of each store, the coding capacity and duration of sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So when we're looking at the model of memory, the multi-store model, if you are drawing the diagram, or even if you're describing the model, make sure you write down the features of those stores, so the coding, the capacity and duration of each of the stores when you're describing the model, to ensure that you can get full marks for that. With regards to the multi-store model of memory, the research support that goes alongside it is what we've just spoken about. So the research support, you can have Badley, Barrick, Peterson and Peterson, Miller, Jacobs. You can have all of those studies. We've got additional pieces of research that support the model. So we've got HM, which was a case study. And in the HM case study, we have the idea that HM, who had severe epilepsy, then he had surgery, and when he had surgery, it caused problems with his long-term memory, where they removed the hippocampus. So he had problems in his long-term memory after brain surgery. However, his short-term memory remained intact, so he still had a good digit span. If you gave him a piece of information to recall, if you tested him, within that 18 to 20 seconds, he could recall that information. But that information couldn't move across to his long-term memory, so he couldn't make any new long-term memories. All of his old long-term memories were intact, but he just couldn't transfer that information from the short-term memory to the long-term memory after his surgery. So that supports the idea that there are two separate stores, because one is damaged and no longer works, but the other one is fine. So there's two separate stores, and information must move across from short-term memory to long-term memory for it to be stored. So it supports the model and how the model works. However, we do have some opposing research, so you can use this as like a limitation in your evaluation. And this opposing research comes from KF, who had amnesia. KF had a poor short-term memory for digits when they were read out loud to him. So this was auditory information. But within his short-term memory, his recall was better if he could read the digits himself. So if he had visual information alongside the auditory information, he could recall it much better. So this suggests that with regards to short-term memory, it's more complex, and the working memory model is a better explanation, because the working memory model focuses on short-term memory, and it suggests that we have a phonological loop where the auditory information would go, and a visuospatial sketchpad where the visual information would go. And this would explain why KF couldn't remember auditory information because his phonological loop was damaged, but he could remember the visual information because his visuospatial sketchpad was intact. So the opposing research suggests that it's not a complete model of memory. It doesn't explain short-term memory in enough detail, and you could say that the working memory model is a better explanation of how our short-term memory works. In evaluation of the multistore model of memory, so a strength is the research support, so you can use any of the studies that we've previously discussed, so Barrick, Badley, Peterson and Peterson, Miller, Jacobs, any of those studies that support the features of the short-term and long-term memory, and they suggest that there are two separate stores. You can also use HM there as well. This research has high reliability and control if it's any of the lab studies. HM doesn't have high reliability and control because it is a case study. However, because it is a case study, you could say that it has more ecological validity because it represents it's a real life situation. They're testing his real life memories, etc. The research shows that short-term memory and long-term memory have different features and suggests that they are separate stores. But the model's oversimplified and doesn't explain different types of memory. And like I mentioned before, it doesn't explain the differences in KF's case study. So the limitation is the opposing research, which shows that memory is more complex. That's the KF that I've just spoke about. Suggests that the working memory model might be a better model of memory. KF shows that there's more than one store in short-term memory, etc. Another limitation, the multistore model of memory suggests that the amount of rehearsal is important. So the more we rehearse something, the more likely it is to go into our long-term memory. However, this study here by Craig and Watkins found that the type of rehearsal is more important than the amount. So it's not that maintenance rehearsal that is important, it's the elaborative rehearsal. So actually, if we have elaborative rehearsal that occurs straight away, so for example, if we're at a crime scene and we see something and it's got context there because we're and state, so we're emotional and we're in a specific place, then we can store that information in our long-term memory, and that information is more vivid in our long-term memory. So this suggests that the model is not a complete explanation of memory, because it doesn't explain how we can have like these snapshot memories that occur, these episodic memories. It doesn't explain these types of memory because it doesn't go into the detail as well of long-term memory. So you know from your lessons that there's different types of long-term memory and like procedural memories and episodic memories. And the multi-store model of memory doesn't elaborate on any of that either. Okay, so that's the multi-store model of memory. So you need to be aware of the model of memory itself, so how it works, and the sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory, the features of each of these stores, so the coding capacity and duration of the sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory, and you need to be aware of the research that supports all of this. So you've got the Badley, Barrett, Peterson and Peterson, Miller, Jacobs, and you need to be able to evaluate those pieces of research that support the features of sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory, and you also need to be able to evaluate the model as a whole. Okay, so that's the first part, which is the multi-store model of memory. In the second part, we'll look at the working memory model. So go back through this, pause it, make some notes if you need to, have a look at the worksheet, see which bits you can fill out so you can draw the diagram, you can define some of the key terms, and have a look at some of the exam questions and go through a few of those.